You don't volunteer for Unit 2, you get assigned it. No. I really do enjoy Unit 2. I'm just saying that. Here's what I'd like for you to get several pieces out so that we've got it all together. If you'll get out the reading, I don't remember the exact title, but it's the Cuban Missile Crisis reading, Thinking in Time, the Use of History for Decision Makers. You're going to need that. You're going to need your cards. You're going to need your journal, and then I put some handouts in the middle of your table. There are 3 handouts, so when you're passing those around, make sure you get all 3 of those. There should be, yes, there's one packet should be 3 pages, and just put those to the side for now. And I actually want to start by having you journal something. And here's what I'd like for you to think about, because we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we're going to talk about it through the lens of that last element of the conceptual framework, which is the decision-making element. So, to kind of get us thinking to that direction, here's what I'd like for you to journal, and I want Heidi and Chris to journal this too. What I would like for you to do is evaluate yourself as a decision maker. And what I want you to journal is when those big issues land on your desk, not the day-to-day issues that people catch you in the hall with, but when those big issues, what is your process for making a decision? What is your process for making a decision? Not the little nitpicky things, the things that land there probably 6 times a day, but you still got to spend some time thinking them through. What's your process? And the fun thing about doing this is I rarely, when I'm doing this unit, I rarely have the opportunity to have 2 people who work together in the room at the same time. Oh, you hear it coming, don't you? I actually had it happen once, and I had 2 principals. One had used to work for the other one and had been promoted. And when I asked the one who had been supervised by the other to describe the decision-making process of the other, he got it perfectly. So Hatley, you're on. What is Chris's decision-making process? What did he write? When those big decisions come up, how does he go about making that decision?
Okay, so first off, he's identifying the problem, identifying the key players, and then starting to talk with the key players, and then finding out what would be his ideal solution for decision. Like if he makes a decision, what's going to be the ramifications that come from it. So what would be the ultimate or ideal ramifications, and then looking at what other solutions could end up popping up that would derail his possible solution, and then considering how does this impact what we were doing and what we want you to do. That's what your paper says, right?
Well, actually, I watched him, and he didn't write near that much, so I'm kind of concerned. I mean, it took him about 10 seconds. So what'd you write?
I said that I seek to understand the conflict by generally asking questions of usually the source. I seek advice from trusted counsel or expert in that area. Consider ramifications and then make a decision or generate more questions.
Okay.
Not
So
bad.
Freddie, you pick up the phone because you need a decision from Heidi. What is her decision-making process?
Well, she always seeks advice. I get back to them and think about it. She always seeks advice. It's one thing that she's very reflective before she makes her final decision.
and I want to repeat back what I just heard because I want to make sure I heard it correctly. What you said was she always seeks advice and then she says, I'm going to think about it. So what I heard was she seeks advice from herself. So Heidi,
She's not gonna give a quick response. She's gonna think, she's gonna get back to me with the final decision, but she's gonna seek advice before she gives me.
Heidi,
She's in the middle of a jambalaya, that's why I'm
and Heidi's decision-making process takes a back seat to jambalaya. I will, from South Louisiana, I'll guarantee I'll agree with that. Heidi, what's your process?
Well, I think through the context, is this something that I need to decide? Is this a decision that I should be making, or is it somebody else? Thinking about the context of what that's about, or what the situation is. Like, we seek advice as appropriate from whoever the decision impacts, so whether it be another regional director, Monty or Brad, or school leaders, or our support team. As part of seeking that advice, I share my thinking, and then I decide, after seeking that advice from the people that I decided that need advice or input, I decide on a timeline for the decision and how it will be communicated, and how it will follow up, or someone will follow up with that decision.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Please do.
Has that thinking changed since you were a school leader and now in your current role?
Yes.
How?
Yeah.
I've slowed down the way when I make decisions. When I was a school leader, especially early on as a school leader, I felt like I needed to make decisions quickly and be a problem solver a lot. And in this role, I've come to realize the fact that sometimes the power of time is really important, and to really be able, number one, to think through, let that situation evolve a little bit, and also for the importance of the advice seeking.
Heidi's also a risk taker.
Say again?
Heidi can also be a risk taker. She can make the decision and then ask for forgiveness later too.
I try to be strategic with that.
We've got people in our organization
But I
like
learned that from Freddie.
But you said something, Heidi, and I want to go back to it, and I'd be willing to bet that if I asked the school leaders in here, I've just got you on the hot seat, so I'm going to ask it. You said as a school leader, I would make decisions more quickly. Who put that pressure on you?
Probably myself, and because I felt I think that instead of always empowering people to make decisions at times, or putting it back on them, when I first became a school leader, I felt like, I remember feeling this way, that it was my job to solve everybody's problems, and I saw myself in that role a lot, is like trying to help and fix and problem solve. And then as I grew as a leader, I recognized the only way to really help people grow is to empower them and to give them advice and input and have them make decisions where appropriate. And then I could help build capacity among the team.
And that's frequently a response we get. And that's why I think it's interesting that we couch this whole section on decision-making in the Cuban Missile Crisis story. Because the one thing I want you to keep in the back of your mind throughout this discussion, from the preliminary part all the way through, it took them 13 days to make a decision. When the safety, security of the country was on the line, 13 days. And there were multiple opportunities within those 13 days to make a decision that could have had catastrophic ramifications. And that's why I ask frequently as school leaders, I think we've all experienced that. I would, I'd go to NISL, I'd be out of my building for 2 days. I'd come back to the building, somebody would catch me, and they knew just where to catch me. It was at the corner of hallways A and C in the back of the building. As I was headed to the front, I would respond without thinking, and by 10 o'clock, I had changed a major procedure in the building that I had spent months to put in place because I answered and made a decision that didn't have to be made right then. It was just one that I fell into. I want to show you 3 quotes. And as you think about your own decision-making process, I want to see where you put yourself in these. I'm not sure sometimes we know why we make the decisions we make. And I'm also not sure that sometimes we put the pieces in place to figure that out as we go through. Because the big point is Colin Powell's quote, eventually you gotta do it. No matter how much we try to stay away from it, we gotta do it. Now, what was interesting as I listened to the 4 of them talking, and if I had more of you share, I'm not as interested right now in the first question because you've already addressed that. But I'm real curious about that second question. What happens when you don't have a process or use a process for decisions, but that third one? What's your process for rethinking and evaluating or reevaluating the decisions you make? If I were to ask the people that you lead what your decision-making process is, I'd get similar answers to what I just got. But I'd be willing to bet as I ask them, I would very seldom get the answer to that third question in the answers that we get. So what is your process? How do you go about rethinking and reevaluating a decision, and what's your clues or cues that you need to do that? Let me hear some thoughts on that. How do you, what are your cues? What tells you it may be time to rethink it?
You can read it on people as you're walking by them.
How do you read it?
Do they look in the eye or not? That's not a short joke, Frank.
What the look they give you.
I really do nothing like it. I honestly, I ask for those people I trust, that I know they'll shoot me straight, and ask for some feedback. Been pretty fortunate along the way to get some. It's not always pleasant either.
I heard you say, I know they'll shoot me straight. Does that mean you can ask anybody and they'll shoot you straight, or
No,
does that
like-
mean you have identified people?
Identify the people I trust.
Okay. Someone else, what are your cues? That it may be time to reevaluate.
Confusion.
Say again?
Confusion.
What does that look like?
So, decisions made, but there's, people are questioning, people are unsure. And people know exactly what is going on, the process, the procedure, and it's running smoothly, whatever it is. You can guess that it's going well, assume. But if there's confusion, if there's a lot of questions, if you're getting pushed back, then you know that you might need to rethink it and evaluate.
Let me hear one more. What are your cues?
You may have data or evidence that's indicating that it was the wrong decision.
Do you repeat what Monty said, you may have data or evidence indicating that it's the wrong decision. Do you know what data you will look for when you're in the initial decision-making process to be able to tell you that? How much of that is part of the planning process? Because that's got to be intentional too, as we look at it. Sometimes we feel like our decision-making looks and sounds and feels a little bit like this. And while that looks doable, not every decision involves a quick yes or no answer. Yes, if this happens, here we'll go. No, if this happens, here we'll go, and that kind of thing. So what we would propose is there's probably a better process to think through, and both, all 4 of the folks that were talking just a minute ago talked about each one of these as they were thinking through. I want you to play with this for just a few minutes at your table, and that's one of the handouts. I want you to take a minute as a table to read the questions that are on those in those boxes, and then I want you to think about, in that particular step, what's another question you would add that's different to go deeper with it? Now notice a couple of things, because I don't want you to just look at the questions. I want you to pay real close attention to the arrows. Because sometimes it's a firm arrow, first you do this, then you do this, then you do this. Sometimes there's a dotted line arrow that indicates a back and forth, that it may or may not happen, but I want you to view this much more cyclically than linearly. But think about the questions that are in each of those boxes, because in a few minutes, when we start looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm going to ask you to consider part of that discussion through the lens of the questions that are on this page. How did they frame the discussion? What feedback did they seek? How did they get the information that went with it? Who was involved in that information? So we'll go through each of these, but take a few minutes to do that. Look at the questions that are up there, then add at least one more question to each one of those boxes as a table.
One of the other things I jotted down in the journal piece is just you need to look at what outcome will provide the most good and the least harm. It may not always be the case, depending on what the issues are.
I think for learning through feedback, you could add what evidence do we have? We could, under learning through feedback, we could say, what evidence do we have?
Would that be under information gathering?
Yeah, I was just thinking it could be there too.
So it would be information gathering
What data or evidence?
I think in framing the assumption, maybe it'd be, we do address, how do we best address the problem in the way ahead, maybe if we do it this way, what could happen?
So what are the consequences?
Yeah, consequences.
I guess feedback could be, have all stakeholders given feedback.
But is that after the decision's been made? The learning through feedback?
It's going both ways, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think, it goes both ways, so. At some point, somebody's gonna come and say, this is a problem and here's why. But and it could be, like, for example, I don't know, I'm just making up, maybe there's a bus issue in the, or a parking lot issue. And parents come in and complain and say, this is a problem. But yet, so, you've got a decision on how it's gonna go, but then they're asking you to make a revision to it. So then I guess, it could go back the other way then too.
And you're revisiting the
Right, you're revisiting
issue again.
Yeah, it's taking too long to get your buses out of the parking lot, so. But yet, and the issues might be that that's the bus lane and they shouldn't be driving in it anyway, or, things like that. So then you might have to check, like transportation might be a stakeholder that you would have to talk to. Maybe the teachers are out there taking too long to help to get the kids on the bus, and that's the issue. So,
Maybe the behavioral issues.
right, yeah, won't get around. And then you have to decide how you can, is there a need, and what do you do? Back about his story, teachers catching it. I learned my first year, don't do that, because I did that, and I gave a
Or
couple
you
of
think you're
decisions.
answering
Yeah,
something
yeah,
just mild.
that I kind of went, what did you do? So I always used to say, oh, you know what, send
Let
me
me
an
get back
email.
to you.
Send me an email.
Uh-huh.
Send me an email, because I won't remember. But actually, it was so I could take the time to think through what I was
Buying
going to
time.
say. Yeah. So I didn't make a misstep. Tell them, oh yeah, sure, you can do that. And then I go,
Wait a minute.
what? You told them what? So then, I had to go back and, in one case, and say, no, I rethought that. You can't do it.
Or there are other people who are impacted by whatever it is, or have input on the decision.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's easy when you have to gather the data. You say, you know what, I'm going to have to talk about it. It's those flyby
They go
decisions
by, yeah.
that can get you in trouble the quickest.
Yeah.
Because it seems innocuous.
Right. Sometimes I'll try to tell them to check in with other people. So I think it's okay with me, but you need to check in with so-and-so and so-and-so because they're all going to potentially be affected.
Newbie administrator problem, thinking you have to solve every problem. Principles that I mentored. Don't rush to solve the problem because lots of times it'll solve itself.
Yeah.
Or say, how do you think you can solve that?
Okay, let's hear some of your thinking. Brenda, pick on you. Start us off. What's one question you'd add, and what box would you add it to?
Sure. So in the framing box, we also obviously thought, what is the context? Making sure we're thinking about the context of whatever the issue is, and how important that is, along with those other questions.
Okay. What's another question, Frank? Go ahead.
I actually thought we needed to add an additional box right after coming to conclusions before we get to take action, and that is communication. But then as we talked about communication in each one of the boxes. The reason being is, first of all, you got to trust this process. There's no point in using it if you're not going to trust it, right? And I think as leaders, our job is just to coach people through it when they come with data, or they're getting feedback. If there's other people, other data points, helping them with that. But I've seen decisions that maybe aren't necessarily the best decision for that situation work because of the execution of it. And then I've seen some, what I would consider the best decisions, not work because of the execution of it. And I think the execution and this process is the communication block. So, I try not to make a lot of decisions with campus, but the one question I'm always asking when people do make decisions is, okay, now, what's the communication plan for them? What exactly is going to be communicated? Who's it going to be communicated to? When's it going to be communicated? And how is it going to be communicated? And I think that's the one piece that's missing from the entire thing.
So, you're saying you were not talked out of putting that separate box?
I originally thought it should be a separate box at the end of it, but then we had some really good dialogue about kind of how that communication process fits in the whole thing. It could be embedded almost in every box, even from the issue. Just identifying, we understand that this is a problem, and now we're going to start working on solving that problem. We've created this task force and we've pointed this decision maker. So I mean, it could almost start right at the beginning.
So you mentioned the idea of a communication plan, and we're going to get more deeply into the Cuban Missile Crisis in a few minutes. But thinking about what you just said, talk a little bit about the nature and types of communication that occurred in that case study and where that would fit in a process like this?
Well, I think there's multiple layers of it, right? I mean, there's the counsel where you're seeking advice and, okay, if this, then what? You know, what's next? But then at the same time, you have an entire country on edge, right? So, I mean, fortunately, we don't have to make decisions like this. You know, our decisions at the school.
Like Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah.
Did you watch the news last night?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, but we're not in charge of it.
Somebody's making them, we hope, but go ahead.
I think there's multiple layers of that communication, and I think that's the important part, right? I know at the school level, it's always the stakeholders. You know, who are the stakeholders? Sometimes, I mean, I think for me, one of the first things is making sure my bosses know, hey, this is something we're doing. The staff needs to know, the kids need to know, parents need to know, the community needs to know. Are there, you know, does the transportation department, I mean, there's so many layers of it as there was in this case study, and I think you have to be cognitive of what the communication is and who you're communicating and how you're communicating to them.
So something interesting happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I want Frank or anybody else to relate that. There was a point at which the decision was made to take the decision maker out of the direct conversations. Because they said if the decision maker is sitting at the table, the lesser players, as they refer to them, would be less likely to be honest and forthright in what was going on. Where does that idea fit into what you're talking about with a communication plan related to something like this?
So if you're looking for, in the end, you're gonna communicate whatever action you're taking. So in that, they were gonna communicate what action they were taking and why they came to that decision. But in terms of the communication that needs to happen in the inside, part of that is pulling in experts, which is what he did, like pulling in experts in different areas, pulling in people to talk about it, and giving them the chance to go through, and I think buy into whatever decision they were making, I guess. And so I would say that communication and him not being part of it was so that they communicate more and get, because part of it is those are the stakeholders that are gonna help in terms of the action, whatever action is taken, they're gonna be all part of the decision-making process. So part of it is like having people that you buy in through the different processes, who you're seeking advice from, or also buying into whatever you are going to decide and the direction that you're gonna go.
Okay. Let me hear another question. What's another question you'd put in one of the boxes?
This table had a couple of good points or questions, one of them being that really, after that take action, it needs to have another dotted line or solid line back to learning through feedback, was one. And then the other part that they discussed was, that there really should be a history framing question. Has this happened in the past? If so, how did you respond? Did it work?
There's a quote that if you didn't highlight it in the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm gonna get you to highlight it now, that ties directly to what you're talking about, then I want to tie it to this discussion. The quote is on page 8. And it's in the third full paragraph, and I'm actually going to read several sentences to support it, but I'm going to start with the one I'm talking about. In cases of which we know, the paragraph starts when Kennedy and his ex-con, but the second sentence is the sentence. In cases of which we know, debate in serious decision situations starts at least 9 times out of 10 with the question, what do we do? Background and context get skipped.
Matt made that point, I think, when we were talking about how the issue is coming before the framing. And the framing really needs to come around the issue.
Do you notice, one more sentence on this, and then I want to point something out. Further down in that paragraph, otherwise, all concern is for the present, with seldom a glance backward or in any focused way toward the future. It's, what do we do now, and how's it going to impact us right now? And let's be real honest, sometimes we're thinking to ourselves, whose boat is this going to rock? And is that really a boat that I want to rock today?
Do I want to be on that boat?
That's exactly right, because sometimes that rocking boat takes me up, capsizes me with it, if I don't think through those pieces. Now, thinking about what we're talking about right now, as you look at this particular model, do you notice that over three-fourths or over of the model has to do with context and vision and only 1/4 has to do with action. And it's not even fair to say it's 1/4 because it's this little piece right up here. Because I want to believe on that coming to conclusions. I hadn't started rocking boats yet, but I better be making a plan for how it's going to impact the people that it results from. But once I get here, it's out there. Now I agree with Brad and that group. I'm wondering why there's not a dotted line between that piece, because I got to be willing to get feedback for what's happening. I've got to be Freddie mentioned earlier, sometimes I've got to abandon the plan because it's not working. So I got to figure that out from the feedback that I'm constantly getting. Let's hear another question that you put in one of the boxes. I know you wrote something because I saw it. I was looking around. So I know it's down there. Bill, go ahead.
We said in the framing the consequences.
Consequences, talk about that one.
Like when we address the problem, we're going to do this. What could be the consequences of doing it this way?
Yeah, because how often we can anticipate the consequences. We can anticipate possible, because that comes under that umbrella of threats and risk also. I got to be figuring out how to mitigate the threats when they do emerge. Matt, you had your hand up. What's another one?
Well, I was just going to ask, the word framing, I'm assuming is intentional. In order for us to be reflective about our practice, the foundations of reflective practice have the framing of the problem, helping us clarify what the actual issue is and not necessarily a symptom of maybe a problem that we're missing. But I don't know if that first question under framing captures that, or do we assume that the big yellow box that says the issue, has it already been appropriately framed? Because when something lands on your desk, at some point you have to determine what is the real problem that you're dealing with.
So let me turn that into a question. How often do we create our own problems by not framing the issue appropriately? Because as I look at that, how should, again, I think we may have lumped two things together and we probably shouldn't have, because we're taking a risk. We're making an assumption that how I should look at the issue is the same as how we should look at the issue. And sometimes I operate and make those decisions thinking about how my team, my leadership team, anyone else is going to respond. The other issue that we've got to think through is sometimes when we think about that we, how should we look at the issue? Sometimes we isolate the we to the same group all the time, and the boat gets rocked by the people that don't have the connection to the we, and then we run into problems. So this notion here, these big decisions like we're talking about, I may not want to hear from the 7th grade math teacher, but I probably need to go ahead and ask her, because everybody else is. I mean, that's, and we invest all this time and effort. Someone else, let me hear another reaction, another question to this particular model. You're laughing, you all know what I'm talking about. You can name her and you know how many years she's been teaching for you. And guess what? You'll leave before she does. So someone, let me hear another question. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Bryce, let's edit that out. Let me hear another question that you would add to the box. Let me hear one more. Melinda, go ahead, Chris.
Edward, it kind of got your question and Matt's question made me think of like, what are the other interests? So we need to identify specifically who's involved and what their interests are in this issue.
Where are you going to put that? Because I agree. It needs to be
I think as you're framing the issue.
Chris, I see that more in their information gathering.
I could get on board with that.
Oh, that was a wimp answer. Support your thinking.
Well, I also, so here, let me, all right, I got called out. So let's put it back in framing, and let me tell you why I thought to put it there. If you're information gathering, they're gonna tell you the interest that supports their needs. So you need to identify from your perspective and maybe even others, what their interest may be in that issue. So then you would do that ahead of time as you frame it.
We put a similar question in learning through feedback, again, after the take action part, who did this decision impact? Because sometimes you don't always realize the impact that a decision has, so going back and learning through that feedback. So we can do it both ways.
There's one other piece of this model, listening to the two of you just then, that I think probably needs to be revised just a little bit. If we're doing what we need to be doing as leaders at each step of the way, I'm not sure any of these arrows should be single head arrows. Because if I'm starting here with framing and I start gathering information and I start getting information that causes me to relook at this or think differently, I probably need to go back to the framing. If I move here to coming to conclusions and I make a decision, but then I start thinking about the ramifications of it even further, I probably need to go back and gather some more information. Because these are decisions that, the ones we're talking about, they're the ones that get us the phone calls, they're the ones that get us the upset teachers, they're the ones that have long-term implications for kids and student achievement. What's our willingness to go back and forth? All right, I want you to keep that out. And I'll show you one more piece, and I want to get through this one, and then we're going to take a break because once we start the Cuban Missile Crisis, it won't work for the break. If you will go to the second handout, the one that is titled Decision-Making Models. One of the things about the Cuban Missile Crisis that makes it fascinating for us to study and look at is the fact that in the Cuban Missile Crisis scenario, these three decision-making models emerge from the behaviors of the players in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when you read further with the Cuban Missile Crisis, they'll reference the fact that these were clearly identified in their behavior, and it was a great example for it. The three models are the rational actor, the organizational behaviorist, and the bureaucratic politician. I would love to tell you there's a fun, creative way to introduce those three models, but that would be wrong, because there's not. But here's what I want you to do, and it's gonna seem a little mechanical, but it's worked for me in the past, and I'm gonna stick with it till something else happens. I'm gonna have you read just the first one, the rational actor, and then I want us to talk for just a minute about what does it look like? What does this model look like as far as some characteristics that are associated? How will you recognize it in the Cuban Missile Crisis? What are you looking for? So just do the first one. What are some unique traits of the rational actor? There's two or three in particular that should help you kind of synthesize it. What do you think? Take a guess.
Sounds like they want to get to the end quickly, to solve the problem.
They want to solve the problem. I'm not sure always quickly, but they want to solve the problem. There's a problem to be solved, and they get to it having thought through multiple possible solutions or considering multiple possible solutions, but they're still getting to the end. What else?
Multiple decision makers.
Multiple decision makers might be involved, but the rational actor is still taking those into consideration as possibilities before they get to the one. What else, Clara?
It said it may neglect the organizational process.
Neglects the organizational process. Here's one thing to remember about the rational actor, and it comes in the title itself. It's an actor.
They don't stay in context.
The rational actor is acting as an individual. The best example from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I don't know the page number right now on the quote, but the best example is when Khrushchev and Kennedy were going back and forth, and there were all these issues that were associated and everything. There's a quote in the Cuban Missile Crisis where Kennedy says, "Why is he doing this to me?" Well, he wasn't doing it to him. He was doing it to the country. But Kennedy was acting as an actor and projecting as an actor, considering that these threats and everything that was coming through, that he was doing it to me as the individual. So the rational actor sees themselves as an individual in this process. But as they're making a decision, they're gonna consider multiple choices, multiple options before they, the individual, the actor, gets to one decision that they would operate from. All right, let's go to the second one. Read the organizational behavior one. I'll go ahead and own up to you the fact that as both a principal and an assistant superintendent, these were the people that drove me nuts. That's exactly right. There's a rule book for everything. And in that rule book for everything, there's a rule. An organizational behavior, it is summed up in the 3 words: standard operating procedure. Regardless of the circumstances, we've already sketched it out. You all have one on your, well, you better have one on your shelves as your supervisor comes in. You have an emergency operations procedure book. What happens in a fire drill? What happens, of course you don't have hurricane drills, but what happens in a tornado drill, hurricane drill? What happens in those things? What are the steps we follow? What's the order that we make the phone calls? Who do we ask first? Those kinds of things. It's standard operating procedure. That's an organizational behaviorist. Regardless of the circumstances, they've already gamed it out. And they wonder why you don't follow the gaming out procedure when it comes up. Let's look at the third one, bureaucratic politics. How would you sum this one up? Say it a little louder, Darren.
I was telling her it's career politician at its finest right there.
What about this one makes it the career politician?
Just the gains, the bargaining, the leverage, you know, their personal interests, you know, moving forward for gain is what they see as important. It's just what Congress and the Senate and all these folks do.
Well, I'm not ready to go that far, but it might work better if there was a little bit of back and forth. I'll give up this if you give up this. We'll make a trade here. So, as we look at it, so that's the bureaucratic politician is the trade-offs and what can I give up in the bargaining and that kind of thing. So, before we take our break, I want you to practice. Go to that third handout, and at your table, I want you to read the school-based scenarios for each one of those and figure out which one is which. Which scenario is bureaucratic politics, which scenario is organizational behavior. Talk about that at your table and be ready to justify why you think it is. All right, you ready to defend your answers? So, Jeff, what's the first one? What'd y'all decide? No, I don't want to know, Jeff. Jason, what'd y'all decide for the first one? Aren't you Jason? Why are y'all looking around when I call your name?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
He was talking to him, but.
I know, but then I thought, well, maybe Jeff remembered the answers from last year. I don't know why I thought that, but I just thought it. What did y'all decide for the first one?
Well, originally we decided that it was rational, and then we came back to it after reading the other two, and possibly could also classify that as bureaucratic.
Okay. Anybody? Okay, let me ask this. They said bureaucratic. How many of you agree with that? Oh, so, Cynthia, what y'all decide?
We put, right, Kim said that it was organizational, and I already stated that she needs to be able to defend that for our table. Or, and if she's right, then we stand united, and if she's wrong, we would have chosen something else.
That is a dysfunctional.
So, yeah, okay, but you're not done. So defend it. Why would you do, why organizational?
I think we were looking at, like, from the decision-making process and just going back to over here, it seemed the most logical. But again, I honestly was going with Kim because I was still reading through them and she had more reasons why, so I was like, I'm going with you.
Okay, Kim, you're up. What's your reason?
I'm being honest to talk now. I know you did.
What's your rationale for organizational?
To me, there seems to be a decision-making process with it, which is part of organizational. The second component to that is it was, as we went through all of them, the other ones fit in other areas, to be honest. In in a more logical sense than that one.
Okay, for me, of those three scenarios, the first one is the easiest one. How many of you agree that it's organizational? Why?
It has chain of command and common practices.
Say that a little bit louder.
Chain of command and common practices.
Standard operating procedures.
When you see common practice, that's standard operating procedures.
That's exactly what we said.
That's, oh, now Kim speaks up. Oh, yeah, that's what I said. Oh, yeah. Okay. It is organizational behavior because common practice, chain of command. There's a way we operate. There's a way we do things. All right. What about that second one? What'd you put for that second one, April? What'd y'all come up with?
We're still debating this.
Bureaucratic politician? So back it up.
I can't because I was still debating the first one, but John can because he's the one that was.
John, you're up.
There's a lot of buses today.
There's a lot of.
Well, a lot of them still receive money, and every 10%, get a test score, so it's a little give and take there.
Okay. How many of you agree that that's bureaucratic politician? Yeah. There's some trade-offs embedded here. He can redirect the money if the PTA does this, if you do this, I'll do this, back and forth. All right. So what's the third one, Jana? Jana, the second part of the question is back it up. So what's the third?
one is the rational actor model.
Okay.
Because it's more of they're acting as an individual. So I believe the ultimate goal is to improve student learning so them making this decision.
That is 100% correct because you believe, because you think this, it's the rational actor acting on behalf of the organization. Great job. So you're ready to find these in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's take a 12-minute break. Come back at 25 after, and we'll get into the case study. But keep this handy because you're going to use those decision-making models. 25 after. If you will, wrap up your conversations. With Ford case study, we had you using a guiding set of questions. We're not going to use that with Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm going to have you looking and talking about some specific information related to the decision-making models. But before I give you 5 or 10 minutes to look back through your notes and your annotations, I want to take you to my favorite quote from this case study. Because I think it sums up, to me, it's one of the most powerful lines in the case study, and it is on page 15. And it's in that partial paragraph that's at the top of the page, and it's the very last sentence. Good judgment is usually the result of experience, and experience is frequently the result of bad judgment. Read that one more time. Good judgment is usually the result of experience, and experience is frequently the result of bad judgment. As we look at these decision-making models, one of the things I want you to be thinking of, okay, what's the connection to my context? Because the thing about it is, what we're going to suggest is the decisions that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis were pretty much the result of people being able to make recommendations, suggestions, and thoughts coming from 3 different perspectives: the rational actor, the bureaucratic politician, and the organizational behaviorist. Because if you remember from the case study, the organizational behaviorist, in the form of the general, wanted to go lambast them pretty early in the process. And I think I told you before, all of our case studies none of our case studies have a good ending except one, and it's this one, because we're all here. But we had to be thinking through and looking at it through the lens of all 3 of those. So I'm going to ask you to take about 10 minutes and look back through what you highlighted and annotated. And what I'd like for you to add to your annotations is, where do you see examples of the bureaucratic politician, the organizational behaviorist, the bureaucratic politician, and the rational actor. Where do you see examples of those based on the descriptors that we looked at a few minutes ago? Let me give you 10 minutes. Okay, to add to the context of what you've already read, I want to play a video, and then I'm going to get you started on a discussion. So,
when Kennedy first learned that the Soviets had deployed their missiles to Cuba, he was outraged. The question was not would they accept it, it was how they were going to get those missiles removed.
Kennedy is considering an airstrike. It's not clear how precise the bombing will be. And you're dealing with nuclear weapons. What if one missile gets launched? One nuclear missile could kill hundreds of thousands of people. One.
The general imbalance is the ratio of 17-1 between the United States and the Soviet Union in deliverable nuclear firepower. But it all depends on how much damage are you willing to sustain. What's unacceptable for you? And for the American administration, even one nuclear warhead on a major city, New York, Washington, Chicago, any major city, would be unacceptable damage.
Soviet Union, would be destroyed, and we would only lose a third of our population. Now, if you think, when you think of someone thinks you only lose a third of your population and you won a war, you're sort of left the world of reality.
The story is amazing, the story of deception. Under the nose of the US intelligence, the Soviets were able to transport close to 42,000 military personnel, innumerable amounts of ammunition, nuclear missiles to Cuba. The deployment is an incredible military feat.
There's no success military operation without secrecy. My father thought what he had to do. We have to send very powerful signal to Americans, don't invade Cuba, we are serious.
Cuba seems to have the same effect on American political leaders that the full moon once had on werewolves. We may not froth at the mouth, but we simply can't deal rationally with Cuba.
There was a revolution in Cuba led by Fidel Castro in 1959, and in 1960, Castro declared Cuba to be a socialist state allied to the Soviet Union. Cuba had been a playground for Americans. They would fly down there, they would go gambling, the nightlife was wonderful, the beaches were wonderful. So it was kind of seen by many Americans as an extension of the United States and as a legitimate extension of the United States.
We have been expecting the invasion since the end of 1960. The logic of the relationship between Cuba and the United States obviously led anyone to believe that there was going to be some sort of invasion. Cuba was ready to fight.
Castro saw Kennedy as a significant threat to the very existence and future, not only of the Cuban Revolution, but of Cuba itself. He is convinced that the Kennedy brothers, being the competitive men that he understands them to be, people who hate to lose, will eventually try and overcome their loss at the Bay of Pigs by invading Cuba again, this time openly with the U.S. military. That is why he accepts the idea of
having these missiles on his territory and the danger that came with it.
Khrushchev likes Castro a lot. It was a lot of early love dynamic, infatuation, flirting, but not completely trusting each other yet, trying to kind of feel each other out, trying to establish the boundaries of the relationship.
Castro may have liked the idea of having the missiles on Cuban soil. It certainly turned Cuba into a major player in the strategic game. But Castro recommended that they not try to do it secretly. He pointed out the difficulty of that. The U.S. has U-2 spy planes overhead almost every day. Wouldn't it be far better to do it openly? Let's sign a new mutual defense agreement.
Fidel was never in favor of putting the rockets in secretly. Never. We had the right to defend ourselves and to have the arms that we needed to defend ourselves, even if those arms were nuclear and 90 miles from the United States. We had the right to do it. But Khrushchev wasn't in favor of that. He said once we had all the rockets here, the United States would know about it and would be able to do absolutely nothing. That was a big mistake.
From October 15th until October 22nd, John Kennedy kept the existence of these missiles in Cuba a secret.
We knew what the Russians were up to. So long as they didn't know that we knew, we might have time to plan our response. JFK, that first morning, asked of us every possible option he had. Military options, every possible diplomatic option, even the possibility of doing nothing at all, though he himself felt that the country would not stand for that.
Cuban Missile Crisis presented Kennedy with a very acute personal challenge, where none of his glamour, his good looks, his religion, his rhetoric, none of the previous virtues, if that's what they were, that went into the Kennedy success story applied any longer in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He couldn't count on any of those. And he's left all alone with a system that's producing all kinds of hot-headed advice.
The nemesis of John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis is thought to be General Curtis LeMay, the gruff and grumpy general who really wanted to just blow Cuba to smithereens.
When LeMay was asked what would he do with Cuba, he said, "I'll fry it," and he meant it.
LeMay and all the chiefs, all four services, want to go to war. This is what they do.
Yes. It never happened before. The people in the White House weren't the most experienced in the world. The Joint Chiefs weren't the most flexible. So there were weaknesses everywhere one turned.
The Joint Chiefs opposed a blockade, in particular a negotiated solution. They thought we should go in and hit the Russians with everything we had, as one of them said. Sounded pretty good, sounded pretty tough.
Kennedy asked his top air chiefs, "Can you assure me that a U.S. airstrike would be surgical, go and knock out all Soviet missiles. And they said, oh, no, sir. There's a high probability we get most of them. There is a possibility of some people in the southeastern part of the United States dying in a nuclear attack.
So it finally comes down that no matter how many advisors you have, frequently they are divided, and the president must finally choose.
And on that happy note, here's the conversation I'd like for you to have. How did the presence and contributions of those three decision-making models contribute to the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis? And as you're talking about that for the next few minutes, I want you to take folks back to page numbers where you see those examples and talk specifically about how it affected the outcome. I'll give you about 15 minutes for that conversation, then we're going to bring it back together.
Yeah, last man standing here.
Well, and I think the military leaders were playing the bureaucratic game.
Yeah.
And that is what they're trained to do. That's what they go to work for every day.
So,
I think with the bureaucratic politics, I think, because everyone's telling them, you got to make a strike, man. You got to do something, Mr. President. And yeah, there's going to be some casualties in the ranks. We can't promise you're going to get all the missiles. But I think deep down inside, John is mistaken about the bureaucratic politics because he believed that Khrushchev was rational. Because, I don't think Khrushchev's going to do anything to hurt us. There's some good in him. And, towards the end, he felt, I knew he'd do the right thing all along. Maybe with the missiles out. So to me, I see that
with
as
70% probability.
Right.
Probably, I don't know about 70% probability, maybe 6, maybe 52, but I think that's what held him off and reacting because he kind of felt it has to. Because obviously he's known him, he's met him. That's why he's saying, why are you doing this to me? Monty, why are you doing this to me? Monty's not doing it to me, he's doing it in my school. But I'm saying, Monty, why? Right. But if I know Monty enough well, I'll say, you know what, he'll probably change his mind. He's not going to fire my whole second grade team.
Right.
He's telling me that he might do it if we don't meet budget, but I'm thinking he'll make the right choice and not fire everybody.
Right.
Every other one.
Every other one, maybe, but not everybody. So I think that's what kind of held him off.
Yeah.
And not
Their
acting.
relationship.
What's funny though, at the end, patience.
It's just a what?
It's just a South. Yeah. If you look at it,
anyway.
I'm from the Southeast, and I was there at the time, so.
Kind of let it work itself out over the course of the time.
Kind of let everything de-escalate.
He just said it.
Exactly. And sometimes
Get away from it.
that's a major strategy.
Yeah.
Obviously not just in war, but in everyday decision making too.
Right.
Do you think that we saw more of the rational actor model and more of the bureaucratic versus organizational?
Yeah, I didn't know. I was looking for organizational. I mean, there was. I think Kennedy followed like a process for decision making.
I do too, but even in the rational, it talks about they walk through the consequences and figure out which ones would best serve the interests of the nation. If they'd have gone quickly, they'd have been in trouble.
Yeah, I think personally that the rational actor model is probably represented more and more in this multiple times.
And then, like you said, the generals, they're down here playing war games.
Yeah, they're saying, let's do it.
And they're all about following procedure.
Yeah, and they're
Yeah, trust me, strike.
They're a little bit here too, yeah.
When I was in the Army, they have a
do this,
procedure
they
for
do
every
that,
damn thing they do.
And then that would be the organizational part too.
It would
so
too.
that's kind of
It fits both.
I think that this whole thing is situated in such a bureaucratic mess that right out of the chute, Castro said, I believe the Kennedys will come after me, so I'm going to bring the big guns here now. It was all
So he's forming an ally with Russia.
Yes.
Had no choice. Because the people that were pushed out of Cuba were the war.
You've got to remember that's all during right before Vietnam. And I don't know when the Cold War era started, but that's not shortly after. Some of the wall was up already. Berlin. The result of World War II.
The Red Scare.
Yeah.
And then him being so close to war, And he's thinking, the Americans want
90 miles off the coast.
This is their fun place right here. They want it back. America's not used to losing, so that's what he's thinking. They're going to take our
Kennedys
country.
weren't used to losing.
Yeah, right.
Right. And look what happened in Vietnam.
Trump extended powers.
Yeah.
So they're not following the
Protocol.
the organizational
You can't help but think about the moment that Kennedy made the decision to bring everybody around the table. Because clearly he wanted to do right by the country and figure out the best consequence. But there's a fear element that's so real there. You can see it in his face.
I know
He doesn't know what to do.
You know, we're really our country was really just out of World War II when you really start to think about it. You know,
Private conversation.
pretty young, it's pretty fresh in their minds. So I get, you know, it's kind of funny to read some of the stuff about the Pearl Harbor after just coming from there and seeing some of that.
Yeah.
The reality is pretty.
He wasn't that far removed.
No, exactly.
But then you got those military leaders that experienced it. Pearl Harbor, you know, they struck first, and they did all this damage, so maybe we have to strike.
Right.
So did you like the video?
All that's taken into place.
And it's also
Within
shorter.
everything he did,
The other one
thing
is
that
like
stood out for me
20,
the whole
25
thing, I
minutes,
wrote
and you
down
don't have time
purpose
for
and
the
vision.
discussion.
He said, if
With
anybody
this,
is
it's
around
a
to write
context
after
video.
this, well, first of all, just takes your breath
But you can
away,
also
meaning
pick
like,
out a
good
number
God,
of
if
the
we don't make it,
decision-making
nobody's
models
even
They're
gonna
all
be
going to
studying
push
it.
the button to
Yeah.
So that helps too.
But they're going to understand that we made every effort to find peace and every effort to give our adversary room to move. So his mission, his vision about what he wanted to happen is very
Advocacy.
clear. Yep. Peace, let the guy move so we don't have to do anything. But there was a terror even about what if we don't do anything. So that still resulted in this.
What if they strike
Well,
first?
and in the end, I think it was win-win because he was patient enough, and we didn't have to do anything drastic.
Where does he say though? What is it, 3-1 that he thought?
Yeah.
3-1? Something
What
like
is
that.
this, 3-1?
Did he say that?
And they said, what are our odds? 17-1. So we can annihilate Russia, but we're going to lose 1/3 of our country.
I just can't imagine the pressure. He just really can't.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, right? How do you like go to sleep at night?
I don't think he did. Looking at his
He was like-
eyes for a little bit, yep.
Probably not.
And 90 minutes, 90 miles away, that's not that far. It's like from here to Flagstaff.
No.
Yeah.
Not very far.
Nuclear weapons being pointed at us from Flagstaff.
Yeah, they just barely get in the air before that thing would have to come back down. It didn't take very long. Well, and then in terms of strategic thinking, wasn't Star Wars wasn't that Reagan? Wasn't he all about Star Wars and creating a system to shoot those suckers down in the sky?
Yep.
Not very long
He's the
after
one
that too.
really led to the close of the Cold War era, the walls coming down. I was in Germany at that time.
You were?
When the wall was still up. So I want to go back now that it's down. I love Berlin. I used to go there. We'd go a couple of times a year. It's such a neat place. But it was a very interesting ride up there. Because you had to cross through communist Berlin to get there. So it's pretty interesting.
How long were you there?
3 years.
Were you married yet?
No. I was single as could be. Loving it.
Well, I was gonna say, then Berlin probably had a whole new lens to it. We won't go there.
No.
I thought it was interesting too, where you stated that it's just as if we suddenly began to meet a number of missiles in Turkey and all that. Yeah, and then he said, "What we did was successful." Like he didn't even realize that we had been doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Today's choices appear when they are in our history, when people look back a decade or a century hence. That's like probably obviously a hefty question for that they had to really think about. Obviously, the consequences and many of the choices that they made.
That one statement fits well with that diagram that he had up before in terms of what that flow chart almost.
Yeah.
In terms of
Yes,
just
yes,
that
yes.
one statement sort of outlines that.
Yeah.
That was
How will my decision
process. That one statement is essentially that.
Yes.
would even be interesting to start thinking like that more at schools. How would this decision impact a student, now that's in second grade, but what about when he or she is in fifth grade or sixth grade? Just really trying to think long term,
right,
like that, and so often it's
We're thinking about right now.
okay, how's this going to impact who's, right now and very short term, as opposed to really trying to think of the long term
their
consequences.
education career. If I failed as a student, what's that education?
The ramification.
Yeah, it's just simply, well, they didn't do it, so here you have it. Long term, what happens?
Yeah.
I wish the teachers would think about that because I remember where I got that research from, but how the students' gap gets larger when they have a bad teacher, but I think it has specific implications of years or something like that. I can't remember what it was.
Exactly what you're talking
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
And
we used to use it a
seen
lot
that.
before. I
Like
just haven't seen it now.
It's like you could tell if you had an ineffective teacher one year, you can tell those kids the next year. Yes, they start to, fill in
But
the gaps
imagine having
and get,
two,
but
let's say second and third grade or third and fourth, and there's 2 years of that's
and how that's detrimental.
I mean, to me, it's like, oh my God, we have a big responsibility.
They didn't have
to
UNGA.
put the right people there.
It took me a minute to figure out what UNGA was, the United Nations General Assembly.
Similar to the teacher that you talked about.
Look at how
earlier.
fast news is coming out of that.
Now we're going to repeat that because for some reason having them in the class again is going to make all of the difference. And then they're going to go to third grade and get that next teacher that affected. I just,
Yeah, it's how it's affecting kids personally, their long-term future. If they have one bad year.
Yeah.
Scary.
And you know how he says about setting the urgency? I think it was much easier, at least when I worked at a previous charter school before I came to Imagine. I could set the urgency with teachers because there were so many of them. That almost like the Ford thing, it was like, you know what, you're not doing your job, I could just get someone else to come in. You know what I'm saying? But now you can't even set that urgency. It's like you're walking on eggshells so that you don't upset them, because then they can say, you know what, I can go somewhere else where it's not that much work.
I know.
I mean, that's so how can you set urgency to those people?
Trying to find a fine balance of, okay, I don't know if there's better out there.
Because you know what, Luisa Fuller, that's the principal in Coachella, she was my teacher at that school over there at Bellington Academy. And she says, man, you were tough when you were our principal over there, and you gave us no option. It's either this way or the highway. And our scores were like really high.
Yeah.
But it was, but we had so many, and I said, yeah, but there was an abundance of you guys.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a line of people applying for a job at that time, credentialed and everything, And now we don't have that. So it's, it's not a job that people can say, well, if I lose this job, they can just go to the next school.
Go to the next school.
Yeah.
And that's how it is.
If I don't like where we're going, or if I'm going to be held, because we just had a teacher, her scores last year were 3%. 3% of her students passed. Okay, so we're going to push you, and here's the percentage that you're going to work towards. Well, that coupled with a couple of other factors, she's leaving because of that accountability system that's being put into place. What do you do with that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You have to push it. Like, that's not.
You can't not push,
but then you have to have that balance, because if you push too hard, then they say, you know what, I can just go.
Go to another school district.
But
you know what, at that
do
school,
we say, we understand that that's the implication, this isn't a good fit for us. Yes, we may not get someone else, but this might actually harm us more.
But then we could get someone else, because there still are good people out there.
Right.
You just
Definitely. Yeah.
you know what, I've had some really good people that I've found, or that have even worked for us already. Let's say, for example, they taught for 2 years.
Yeah.
But they didn't pass the test. so they can't continue with an emergency, but they're amazing teachers, and I can't put them back in the
That's
classroom.
so frustrating.
And then I have
Send
to
them to
hire.
Arizona, we take anyone.
An emergency service.
I know.
Really
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah.
Do you
I mean-
not have that, like the emergency service?
I want to, if you'll come on
If they
back.
pass the test, they can get into an internship, but if they didn't pass it in the summer,
I want
interns
to
are only
use
in the
these
fall.
last few minutes that
So
we
they have
have.
to wait a whole year. Let's say that she passes it in October.
I want to use these last few minutes that we have to kind of wrap this up. Because what I can say with confidence is JFK did not go through Unit 2 of NISL. As a result, he did not have the nifty little ring of laminated cards. However, I can also say, as you watch this, it's a pretty good example of someone working their way through that strategic thinking process. What I don't want to do is take the time that we have to go back through the context, but I do want to have some conversation. What was the vision? Because if we're going to say that, yeah, it was a pretty good example of the strategic thinking process, then context drives vision, and vision drives strategy.
The vision was it to remove the missiles from Cuba and to not annihilate the United States.
Yeah, I was gonna say, keep
So
our
say
country
that
safe.
louder, Freddie.
The vision was to remove the missiles, the threat from Cuba without any kind of casualties, whether it's casualties on our front or casualties on Cuba's front.
Was that the vision that was in place at the beginning, the middle, and the end of those 13 days?
No.
I'd say, I would think towards the end, I would think.
Towards the, back that up.
Because I think he was, the president was thinking, he knew President Khrushchev and his intent, and he felt like if you waited long enough, those missiles, he would do the right thing and remove the missiles. In my understanding of what I read.
Go ahead. Other thoughts on
I think
that?
part of it was also that Kennedy's probably thinking in the back of his mind, what do I do to prevent World War III?
Yep.
Because that was a lot of the discussion, I think, behind the scenes. And how do we do that?
What was the vision at the outset, at the beginning? Because it's stated in the case study.
Just want to get them out.
Say again?
Just want to get them out right away. Just
Get 'em
blow
out.
to smithereens.
Now, as he began to work his what context drives vision, vision drives strategy. If he started with that vision, as he began to work through his strategy, what caused him to change the vision?
Information.
Because his vision moved from get them out to get them out without a lot of deaths.
Yes.
Information.
So there was the risk associated with the surgical strike that may not happen. What else?
Loss of life.
Karen?
I think there was also some concern on his part about what would happen and how he would be remembered. Would he be remembered as the person who caused the death of zillions of people, or would he be remembered for making a good decision and solving the problem? So I think he began to think about politically, how do we play this game so that I'm not increasing the risk?
Specific to the text, he said, I will not have a book written that says missiles in October.
Think about that for just a minute. As the leader, that came into play. And when we think about a strategic thinking process, that conceptual framework for strategic thinking, we cannot ignore the fact that that was an interest that was associated with this entire structure. He had multiple interests. He didn't want the deaths. He wanted the missiles out. He didn't want all these other pieces, but that was also an interest that played into it. Will I be viewed as someone who made a decision that was so catastrophic that it will forever be in history? What else might have changed his vision? What other factors?
I don't know if else is sorry, but Khrushchev. I mean, at some point he realized that Khrushchev is his own actor as well. And how well do I know this man? How well do I know who he is and who's pulling his chains behind the scenes? How much predictability can I get around also the organizational behaviors of Russia in the past?
And that was evident when he put himself in Khrushchev's shoes too. Said, how would I feel if I was him with this, this, and this?
Why should that matter? Why did it matter?
Well, because it's the bureaucratic, we actually says like reverse bureaucratic, politics. You're trying to see it from the other person's angle, their perspective. And I think, the mission of Kennedy changed once they realized they weren't in the driver's seat the way they thought they were, right? I mean, even the fact that the missiles got there was something that was a sore eye, black eye for us, so.
When he realized that they had essentially done the same thing to Russia by putting the missiles in Turkey.
I'm trying to find, there's another statement in here that I think is extremely telling, and I can't find it right away. But it references the fact that basically the players in this whole case were not acting as the norm. That they played out more, now that history looks back at it, now that we can go back and listen to the conversations, that they played out more possibilities without acting on those. Oh, here it is. It's on page 15. It's the paragraph that starts the 13 days of the missile crisis, but it's the last sentence. Nevertheless, Kennedy and his ex-com seem to us exemplary for the extent to which they ask, how well-founded are the presumptions on which we plan to act? How well-founded were those presumptions that caused us to back up and say, well, if we do that, we can do it. But then this, and this. So maybe we need to rethink that strategy. And I got to believe that as they began to work their way through some of those, that's what caused that vision to change and say, we've got to play this out a little bit differently or we're going to be answering for a long time. As I told the group, I'm glad they did. I was in the Southeast during this time. So I'm glad we didn't go ahead and write that one off. But think about that and think about the implications and the ramifications that go with it. Other thoughts as you had this conversation about the role of the three decision-making models, how the vision changed, what does that have to do with you? So let's just start there. What does this have to do with you?
Well, Kim brought up that for the amount of time and analysis that they took over something that's really important, like none of our decisions have this much impact. And we need to remember that in terms of slowing down and taking time for the process. Like if that can be done for this level, then we should do the same.
And it may not rise to the level of that impact, but I got to tell you, having watched the news the last 4 to 6 weeks of the people being rescued from hurricanes, when you stop and look at the status that those people are being rescued from, they don't have the money to move someplace else. They don't have the jobs that they're leaving, all of those things. So for that one individual kid, yeah, this is a pretty big deal. It may not rise to nuclear status, but it's a pretty big deal when we're talking about the next 20 to 40 to 60 years of that kid's life. Someone else, what does this have to do with us? Why do we spend time on looking at something?
We need to learn as leaders multiple tactics to solving complex problems. And then, these are three thinking processes to consider when we're working through a very challenging situation.
I also think it demonstrates the necessity of patience in the process.
It also informs us and gives us a different way of looking at people and issues that we were in. The more we understand how different things are thought through and different models are there, it widens our ability to perceive who we're talking to and how that relates to the decisions that we're making.
Because our decisions are a pretty big deal. Nancy, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, I was so impressed with the diversity of people that he brought in with different backgrounds, different knowledge, different experience, and he listened to all of them. All of them were valued. And I think sometimes we insulate ourselves to seeking advice from just a small group of my team members and not really reaching out to as many as I should.
I don't think anybody would question the fact that JFK was a card-carrying Democrat. He brought the Republicans to the XCOM, and it was a secret process, and nobody told. Chris?
Two things stuck out to me. The first being the constant need to reevaluate the context and the importance of that when you talk about threats and risks. And then the other element that kind of stuck out, when we looked originally at the three models that you provided us, we kind of looked at the bureaucratic model as like a negative piece. And now I'm looking at page 14 where Kennedy says, the second paragraph where he says, we don't need to get hung up on the bombers. Like everything needs to go, however, we don't need to get hung up on that. So it's again that reevaluation and then going back to what's our core business and what can I leverage to make sure that I get that.
Yeah, because don't forget that quote on the next page. Good judgment is usually the result of experience, and experience is frequently the result of bad judgment.